Okay, so this is before I jump into things, I'll just give a brief overview of what the webinar is going to be covering. So I guess I'll start with a background on myself. I quizzed for 6 years, and the last 2 years I've been coaching and quiz mastering. So this presentation, I'll be going over the rules of all the question types, the objective rules, and then some of my subjective opinions on what makes a good or bad question, and then I'll at the end I'll touch a bit on lists. So I'll talk first about a little bit about motivation behind different question types and question writing. Then I'll give some resources that you can use to help you learn how to write questions and also write them. And then talk a little bit about context. And then I'll go into talking about interrogative and multiple answer questions, finish and quote questions, situation questions, reference questions, talk a little bit at the end about question list writing for anyone who might find that useful. And then at the end, hopefully you'll have time for question and answer. So let's jump right into it. So talking about question writing motivation, I guess, what is the purpose of a question? And there's different question types, and why are there different question types? So I guess I broke it down into two main purposes. The first purpose of a question is to test a quizzer's knowledge of the material. So like a straightforward question would test their verbatim, or not their verbatim, their knowledge of the overall material and the words of the material. And reference questions test more of the reference knowledge of the material. And then I think, but more important purpose behind questions is to give quizzers an opportunity to recite scripture in front of others. And I think this is something that should be kept in the back of our minds as we're writing questions or answering them. But these purposes should be kept in mind when writing questions for a question set, asking questions at quiz practice, coaching. And so this webinar will cover all the technical rules and requirements, but I just thought it would be good to mention that before I dive into all the technical stuff, because it's sometimes easy to forget why we're doing all this stuff. It's for quizzers to have an opportunity to recite the scripture that they have memorized. Okay, and then I guess some applications of knowing how to question write that I have found for myself include writing questions for a question set, producing questions on the spot at quiz practice. There might be some times where you might forget questions at home, or just you have run into a scenario where you might have to come up with questions on the fly as you're quiz mastering. And so knowing how to write questions gives you that ability to ask pretty much every single type of question on the spot at quiz practice. And then also teaching quizzers how to write questions. Of course, advising quizzers how to better respond to or initiate challenges. If you know the rules better as a coach, you can better coach your quizzers on how to respond to challenges. And then coaching quizzers on how to respond to questions, because if they know what the context of a question is and how it's written, they can much better know how to respond to one, particularly reference questions, as we'll talk about. And then jumping into resources. So there's two main resources. There's the rule book, of course. It contains all the question writing requirements. That's what I'm pretty much basing most of the content of this webinar on. And it can be found on the CMD Bible Quizzing website under rules, under the rules tab. And then the second tool or resource is the Christian Bible Quizzing application. And this, I won't really be covering it much at all in this webinar. I'll just be hinting on it. We're likely going to have a webinar on CBQZ later on in the year, but it's a useful tool for writing all different types of question types, particularly useful for writing reference questions. And it can be found at cbqz.org/app. Now, the Christian Bible Quizzing original website used to have a link to the app, but you have to actually directly go through the link now if you want to access it, I believe. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the slides, like I mentioned, the PDF version of the slides, if you just joined and don't have that link and you want to see the slides, they're at that URL, and they'll likely be posted or shared later for people who missed this meeting. So now I'll talk a bit about context. So what is context? So it's technically speaking, it's a range of verses from the question's reference, and it's limited to 5 verses before and after the reference for all questions, except for quotes, finish the verses, and CBRs. So say you had a straightforward question from Acts chapter 5, verse 10. 5 verses after, meaning you go 5 verses after would be 11 to 16, and 5 verses before would be 4 to 9. So really it's a 11 verse range that is context for most questions except for quotes, finish the verses, and CBRs. And those questions, context is just the verses that are being quoted or being referenced. Yeah, so the context is limited to the one, sometimes 2 verse range of a quote, finish the verse, and CBR question. And it's a 2 verse range when it's a quote 2 or a finish 2 verses. Context is usually thought of being important for quizzers when answering, right? You want to stay in context. If your answer is out of context, you'll be called incorrect. This is common on lots of straightforward interrogative or straightforward questions when quizzers might give answers that are out of context. And that's what we typically think of when we think of context, but it's also important to question writing as well, because for a question to be valid or to be able to be used in a quiz, its answer must be within context, right? Because if you're asking a straightforward question where maybe it's referring to a pronoun he, and then the clarification to that pronoun maybe is outside of, maybe it's 7 verses before, right? You could definitely write that question, but it wouldn't be valid because the answer would be out of context. So you have to make sure that whenever you're writing questions, particularly, you don't really have to worry about for references or finish the verses or quotes, but for the other question types, you have to just double check and make sure that your answers stay within context. Okay, so that's covering context, and I'll just quickly check the chat to see if there's any questions. Nope. Okay, we'll keep going. So let's go on to straightforward and multiple answer requirements. So there's 3 main requirements for straightforward and multiple answer questions. And yeah, there's actually more to them than you'd first realize. They seem like relatively simple questions, but to write them, you just have to make sure you follow these requirements. So first of all, you must have exactly one inserted interrogative word at the very beginning or at the end of a question. So an interrogative word are words like who, or all these words actually. Who, whom, whose, what, why, where, when, which, how. Those are all the possible ones. Unless I missed one. I don't think I did. But yeah, so you have to have one of those words either at the very beginning or at the very end of the question. You can't have one in between. It's got to be at the very beginning or at the very end. So yeah, an example of one being at the beginning of a question, what proofs? Convincing proofs from Acts 1 verse 3. An example of a question with a interrogative at the end would be convincing what proofs? Again, from Acts chapter 1 verse 3. The second requirement is that, I'm talking about straightforwards and multiple answers at the same time. So that first rule that I just mentioned, the interrogative word goes for both straightforward questions and multiple answer questions. This requirement depends. So if you have a straightforward question, if you're writing a straightforward question, it must have a single answer. And if you're writing a multiple answer question, it must have multiple answers. Yeah, an example of a question with single answer is what period? A period of 40 days from Acts chapter 1 verse 3. Multiple answers would be those present were who, and then this long list of names from Acts chapter 1 verse 13 is an example of a multiple answer scenario. Now there's things that it's tricky when you are dealing with multiple answers because there's things that don't count as multiple answers, and I'm going to cover those now. I guess here's another example of a multiple answer. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius what? Met him and fell at his feet in reverence. This is from Acts chapter 10, verse 25. So those are 2 examples of multiple answers. But like I said, there are cases in which it may appear that there's a multiple answer in the material, but really there isn't. So I'll cover those now. So the clarification of a single answer is not a multiple answer. That's kind of a confusing statement, so I think it's easy to understand if you have an example. So the question, who performed great wonders? And actually, I should have mentioned this earlier. It might be handy to have your quiz book on you so you can view the material, because I'll be giving a lot of example questions as we go through. So it might be helpful to have your quiz book or material open on the side. So like I was saying, the clarification of a single answer is not a multiple answer. The question, who performed great wonders? Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, right, is the answer. Now the answer is Stephen to that question. Who performed great wonders? It was Stephen, right? But if you're clarifying Stephen from Acts chapter 6 verse 8, if you're clarifying, or rather, describing Stephen, he's a man full of God's grace and power. You might think at first that's a multiple answer, but it's not. It's just a clarification of what kind of a man Stephen was. And then the second thing that's not a multiple answer is the identification of a single pronoun. So an example of this is, who addressed the Sanhedrin? He, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, from Acts chapter 5, verse 35. Now it's describing him there in two different ways, right? A Pharisee and a teacher of the law. And those are both clarifications of the pronoun he, but they would not make that question a multiple answer. They would make it a straightforward. So the two questions I'm just showing here on the screen, both those would be single answer, straightforward questions, not multiple answers. And then the third thing that does not constitute a multiple answer would be the identification of a plural pronoun with more than one clarification to the pronoun. And this one is kind of hard to find an example of, but I did find one. They presented who? These men, Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, etc., in Acts chapter 6, verse 6. So in that case, the plural pronoun is men. And the answer is all these men. Now, this one is a bit more iffy. And again, like I said, there's really rare examples of this, because typically when you have a plural pronoun, it's immediately followed by the men. I'm just going to look at my quiz book here. So yeah, if you turn to Acts chapter 6, verse 6, yeah, so in verse 6, it reads, they presented these men to the apostles who prayed and laid their hands on them. Now, if you were to clarify these men, you'd have to go back to verse 5, where you would list all the names. And that's kind of debatable, but arguably the answer, these men, is the answer to the straightforward question, and it wouldn't be a multiple answer. But yeah, there's one case where a plural pronoun with more than one clarification is not a multiple answer. And those are quite rare. Usually you don't have to worry about them, but it's useful to keep that in mind when you're writing multiple answer and straightforward questions. Okay, and then the third requirement, yeah, that second requirement was quite complicated, but it's as long as you keep in mind when you have a clarification in a straightforward question to watch out for. If it's a clarification that has multiple answers, it's not a multiple answer. That's a good way of keeping track of it. If there's no clarification, you usually don't have to worry. You don't have to worry about it at all. You just have to see, is there a single answer or is there multiple answers? Okay, the third and final requirement for a straightforward question or a multiple answer question would be that they must include a unique word or 2 or 3 word unique phrase within the first 5 words of the question. So those are basically words or phrases that appear only once in the material. And the reason why they must include them in the first 5 words is if the quizzer did not have a unique word or phrase within the first 5 words of the question, they likely would not be able to locate in the material where the question is asking, because there'd be maybe multiple cases of the same phrase. And that's actually where reference questions comes into play, but we'll talk about that a bit later. So yeah, the third requirement is they must include a unique word or phrase within the first 5 words. An example of a question with a unique word in it is what teacher? A teacher of the law, from Acts chapter 5, verse 34. With a 2-word phrase, for about 40 years he endured what? Their conduct in the wilderness. That's from Acts chapter 13, verse 18. And then finally, with a 3-word phrase, these ones are more rare, but they do exist. I will give you what? I don't think I highlighted 3-word phrase, but in that case, it's I will give is the 3-word phrase. I will give you what? The holy and sure blessings promised to David. So that's the third requirement of a straightforward and multiple answer. And then following also from these requirements is you must ensure that the question and answer follow clearly from each other. And if they don't, and if the question is very hard to follow and it's tricky or misleading, then the question is invalid. So you have to ensure the question and answer follow clearly from each other. And yeah, similar to what I just said, yeah, avoid vague and misleading phrasing that can cause the question to be misleading. And then, yeah, ensure the question either has a single answer or multiple answers, and ensure that the question itself is answered. So avoid answers that are the negative of the question, because these questions are invalid because they don't answer the question, right? So an example of this would be, but if it is from God, you will what? Not be able to stop these men, from Acts 5 verse 39. So you'll see here, the question really isn't answered. It's asking, you will what? But then the answer is what you will not be able to do. So the question is not answered, therefore it's invalid. So avoid negative answers. I guess a valid question would be, but if it is from God, you will not what? And then the answer would be able to stop these men. So be careful of that. And then a question that does not meet these 4 standards, like I said, can be declared invalid, challenged, or thrown out by the quizmaster. So usually, though, if you're following the 3 main requirements that I listed, having an interrogative at the beginning or the end, not having or having a single or multiple answer, and then having that unique 2 or 3 word phrase in the first 5 words, most of the time you'll be fine and the question and answer will follow clearly from each other and be answered and so forth. But it's nice to just skim these over and just make sure that you kind of have them in the back of your mind when you're writing in straightforward questions. That way you can avoid negative answers and things like that. So those are all the requirements. Those are set in stone. Those aren't my words. These are taken from the rule book. Now here's some suggestions I have about writing straightforward and multiple answers. I found that typically when you're writing questions, a shorter question prompt length is usually better, but not so short that it's just only the unique word or only the 3-word phrase, because often those questions can be interpreted as tricky. So the way I think of it is write a question prompt that is just long enough to be clear, needing no interpretation by the quizzer, and then, of course, unique within the first 5 words. So in my practice, I try to keep the prompt length as short as possible while also needing no interpretation from the quizzer. So in some cases, the question might need to be longer if the answer requires a longer question. And if the quizzer would have to interpret that question in order to get to the answer, then you usually have to, that's a case where you have to make the question longer. But yeah, shorter is usually better, is what I usually like to follow. And then avoid writing questions with pronoun answers, such as us or you, that have no clarification. And the reason why I would avoid this is not because it's necessarily invalid. It's just because I find those questions and answers don't really have much meaning, especially when they have no clarification, like I said. So if the answer is us or you, then it really, whenever I'm writing straightforward questions to be quizzed on, right, for the district set, I'm keeping in mind, okay, is the answer going to kind of have at least some sort of meaning and give at least complete a phrase or a thought that the question is asking? And if it just has a pronoun answer that has no clarification, it's usually not going to do that. So that's why I avoid writing questions with those pronoun answers. It's not to say they're invalid. It's just I avoid writing questions with those answers. And then I'd say the only exception to this is if you're a quizzer making a list, because if you're a quizzer, you want to make all the questions that you can, that are possible. Now, I don't know, this wouldn't be apply really straightforward lists. No one really makes those, but multiple answer questions, you would want to take this into account and you'd write all the questions that were possible. But if I'm writing questions for a district set to be quizzed on by a quizzer, I would avoid questions with pronoun answers. And then avoid writing questions that are like situation questions. So a situation question, as we know, has a quotation. And so if your straightforward question is, then Stephen replied what? Then the reason why I avoid writing questions like those is that they're already tested in the situation question type. So I just avoid writing those questions simply because they're likely already going to be asked in the form of situations. And honestly, situations are a better way of asking that type of question because they start with a quotation, not with a generic seeming phrase like "then Stephen replied." And so I generally avoid writing questions that are like situation questions. Yeah, so they're already covered in the situation type. Okay, and then I have some examples to go through of what I'm classifying as good, worse, and then invalid straightforward questions. So I have a few examples to run through. So first example is from Acts chapter 9, verse 7. And the question is, who stood there speechless? The men traveling with Saul. And so I would classify this question as good. It meets all the requirements. It's got a straightforward answer that requires no interpretation, and it has a complete phrase or thought. So I would classify that as a good, straightforward question. And then we'll go to example number 2. God has, and this is from Acts chapter 10, verse 28. God has shown me that I should what? Not call anyone impure or unclean. So immediately you should think that is going to be invalid, right? Because the answer is the negative of the question. The question asks, I should what? And the answer says what you should not do. So yeah, it's invalid. The question has a negative answer and is misleading. Another example, who went into the synagogue? Paul. Now, at first glance, this is from Acts chapter 17, verse 32. At first glance, this might seem like a totally normal, fine question. However, the phrase went into the synagogue appears twice in the material. So, unfortunately, that is not a valid, straightforward question. So, because remember, you have to have a unique phrase or a unique word in the first 5 words, and this whole phrase is not unique. So, it's not valid. Example 4 from Acts chapter 9, verse 17, sent me why? So that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, I would say this is definitely a valid question, and a question that could be asked in a quiz very well. But as a question writer, I would likely not lean towards writing it this way. I would say that the question itself is vague, and it could probably be written better. If I just flip to Acts chapter 9, verse 17 here. 17. Yeah, so the question is, sent me why? And it's a relatively short, I'm guessing that it's a 2-word phrase, right? Yeah, so the context is Ananias is entering Saul's house and placing his hands on him. So in that case, you might have to make the question longer, right, to make it better. So you could say this one actually would be a fairly long question because in order to get to who me is, right? That's Ananias. You have to go quite far back in the verse. So that might end up being a quite long question. So it could be maybe Ananias went to the house and entered it, placing his hands on Saul. He said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here, has sent me. Why? Right. So that's definitely a longer question, but I would argue it's a better question because it's not as vague and it's a more complete thought. And yeah, overall, it's better, even if you have to make it longer. So sometimes shorter is not better, as you can see here. Sometimes shorter is worse because you lose the completeness of the question and answer. Okay, I got a few more examples here. Who regained his strength? He, Saul, from Acts chapter 9, verse 19. This is a good question. It's got a pronoun clarification, which is in context, and it's a straightforward question. And by straightforward, I mean easy to follow, needing no interpretation. From Acts chapter 9, verse 21, there's those who heard who? Him, Saul. I would classify this question as worse. The question phrasing is sort of difficult. Those who heard who is quite the mouthful to say if you're a quizmaster, and it's also very confusing if you jump in the middle of it. So I might rephrase that. I'm looking at Acts chapter 9, verse 21 now, as Acts 9, verse 21. I seem to have the wrong reference for that. But yeah, and that's another case where you'd want to make the question longer, like I just mentioned before, to make it more complete and less vague. Another example from Acts chapter 16, verse 34, had come to what? Believe in God. Also, the question is a little vague. Had come to what? Doesn't really let us know who's coming to what or really anything that's going on. It's a very vague question based on a 3-word phrase. And so this one should be made longer to be written better, to be more clear to the quizzer and require less interpretation. In him we what? Live and move and have our being, from Acts chapter 17, verse 28. This one is invalid because there's more than one answer if you write it as a straightforward question, but it's a good question if you ask it as a multiple answer. And then I have 2 final examples of good questions here from Acts chapter 9, verse 34. Who heals you? Jesus Christ. And then who will dream dreams? 2 key words in there from Acts chapter 2, verse 17. Your old men. Those I would classify both as good questions. They're short, but they have a complete phrase or thought and require little to no interpretation by the quizzer, which makes them good. Okay, I guess I'll check because I just finished straightforward questions there. Are there any questions? I guess there aren't any questions in chat. Again, if you have any, put them in there and I'll check at the end of every section. So now we're moving on to finish the verses and quotes. Okay, so there's actually quite a few subtypes, if you will, of these different questions, but I'll cover them all. So a quote, the requirements for a quote question is that it must be one verse long only, can't be 2 verses. The entire reference is part of the question. And you'll see what I mean when I keep going here. And the question text should be in the form of, quote, Acts chapter 1, verse 1, or insert the book and the chapter and verse numbers there, and that will constitute the question text. So when you're writing a quote question, it has to follow that exact format, or when you're asking it. So yeah, example, quote Acts chapter 1, verse 1. And what I meant by the entire reference is part of the question, meaning is if the quizzer jumps before you finish the verse number, of course, they have to finish it. So that's that. And then quote 2 verses, very similar. They're very similar. They must be 2 consecutive verses. So they have to be verse 1 and 2, or 3 and 4, or 5 and 6. They can't be verse 2 and 1. You can't ask them that way. They have to be consecutive. And yeah, the entire 2-verse reference range is part of the question. The text should be in the form of, quote, book, chapter, so quote, Acts chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 is a way to phrase a quote 2 verses question. And moving on to the requirements for finish types. So overall, for all different finish types, so for finish the verses, finish this, finish 2 verses, finish this and the next, they have to follow these requirements. So the question text must be the first 5 words of the material starting based on the question type. So if it's a finish the verse, it'll start at the beginning of the verse. If it's a finish this, it must start in the middle of a verse. And that's the question text. And so these first 5 words must be unique to all questions of that exact type. So, for example, if you're asking a finish the verse, the first 5 words of that finish the verse must be unique to all other finish the verses. Not necessarily all finish thises, but all finish the verses. In other words, the starting 5 words of that verse have to be unique to all the starting 5 words of all the other verses in the material. And then for a finish this, the first 5 words in the middle of that verse have to be unique for all the possible first 5 words of the middle of a verse in all the material. We'll review it once we go back to those question types, but there's no easy way of putting that really. So requirements for finish the verse is that it has to begin at the beginning of a single verse and finishes at the end of that same single verse. So it can't go 2 verses long. Finish this has to begin in the middle of a verse and finish at the end of that same verse. and it must start at the beginning of a sentence or quotation. So you can't start a finish this in the middle of a sentence, even if it might make sense. You can't start it after a comma or a semicolon. You have to start it in the beginning of a sentence or a quotation. So when someone starts to talk. Finish two verses, begins at the beginning of a verse and continues to the end of the next verse. Very similar to finish the verse, only you're going two verses long. Finish this and the next, begins in the middle of a verse and finishes at the end of the next verse. So very similar to a finish this, only you're ending in the end of the next verse. And it must start at the beginning of a sentence or a quotation. And the whole reason why we have finish this and the next and finish two verses is because when you have verses that maybe don't make sense by themselves, read out loud by themselves as just a verse standalone, when you include that second verse, they make much more sense. That's why we have the finishes in the next and finish two verse question types. And same thing for quote two verses. When two verses make more sense than one is the reasoning behind that. And then some suggestions I have for writing finish and quote type questions. Again, there really isn't too much to writing these questions. As long as the verse stands alone by itself relatively well, or the two verses stand alone by themselves relatively well, then it's fine. But here's some suggestions I have. Avoid writing questions on verses that sound incomplete when read by themselves. Now, what I meant by this is there are verses that have a complete phrase or a complete thought, and they end in a perfectly fine sentence and a period, and they're nice. But some of them don't make sense to read out loud by themselves. I'm imagining this like, of course, all verses are of spiritual significance, but some verses make much better sense in the context of the whole chapter, like when you're reading through the whole chapter, than by themselves. And we'll get right into some examples of those, of what I'm talking about. So an example from Acts chapter 15, verse 12. You know the message God sent to the people of Israel, announcing the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. Great verse. It's a good finish the verse. It's a complete thought, and it stands alone when read by itself. From chapter 14, verse 5, there's a plot afoot among both the Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat them and stone them. Now, this is technically, if you read through the rule book, it is not invalid, but I would strongly advise not writing this verse, because when a quizzer quotes this verse on the platform, right, I would say it's not, in the context of the chapter, it makes much, much more sense, right, when you're reading through the whole chapter. But if you're just going to stand up and read this verse out loud, it doesn't make as much sense. And so I would avoid writing and finish the verse for these types of verses. So I would say this is a worse question, and arguably this verse does not make sense to read on its own. And then from Acts chapter 19, verse 12, we have an example that starts with 7 sons of Sceva, a Jewish chief priest, were doing this. What were they doing? We don't know. We don't have that material. The verse just ends there. So it's an invalid question, not a complete thought. So this finish the verse would be invalid. From Acts chapter 2, and then, so those are 3 different examples of a good finish the verse with a complete thought and stands by itself when read out loud. A worse one does not, that maybe is a complete thought, but doesn't really stand well by itself. And then an invalid one that just isn't a complete thought to begin with. And so now I'll give examples of a finish this. So a finish this is from Acts chapter 2, verse 25. I saw the Lord always before me, because he's at my right hand, I will not be shaken. And if I go back to that reference, I believe, yeah, this is referring to, so the verse reads, David said about him, I saw the Lord always before me, because he's at my right hand, I will not be shaken. So in this case, it makes a lot of sense to write a finish this instead of a finish the verse, because you don't necessarily need to know when quoting this verse by itself that David said it. It's a great standalone phrase quoted by itself. So that's why you'd write a finish this. And then a finish two verses. An example of that is from Acts chapter 5, verses 38 and 39. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone, let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. So that's a very good example of you really need the whole 2 verses to be able to get the complete thought that Gamaliel is trying to convey here. If you were just to leave it at 1 verse, it would not be a complete thought. So finish 2 verses is useful in that regard. And then another example of a finish this and the next is from Acts chapter 10, verses 30 and 31. Suddenly a man in shining clothes stood before me and said, Cornelius, God has heard your prayer and remembered your gifts to the poor. Now there's very few finish this and the next in this material. This is one of the few I was able to find, but in this case, you're starting in the middle of a verse, carrying on to the end of the next verse, and it makes much more sense in this case to include that next verse because it makes the standalone verses read much better. Okay, so that's the end of finishes and quotes. I'm just going to check the chat briefly to see if there's any questions. Nope. Okay, awesome. I'll move on. I guess most questions would be better said out loud than typed because I've. Okay, situation requirements. So situation questions are made up of 2 parts. Up to 3 questions regarding the situation of the quotation from the following interrogative. So the situation is like, who said it? About whom was it said? To whom was it said? How was it said? Why was it said? Where was it said? Or when was it said? So a situation question is basically quizmaster gives the quizzer something someone said, and they are going to answer by finishing the quotation if they need to, and then also giving them kind of the context around the quotation, who was saying it and who they were saying it to. So that's the first part, is the questions. So who said it, about whom, to whom, how, why, where, and when. And you can have up to 3 and no more than 3 of these in a single question. Yes, and so then the second part of a situation question is the quotation. So the quotation must be direct from the material, from a person or from an entity. It must not exceed 2 verses in length. So, for example, I think a good example of this is Stephen's speech. It definitely exceeds 2 verses in length, so that the whole speech would not constitute a quotation. It would just be the first 2 verses that you could use. And then the first 5 words of a quotation must be unique to all possible quotations. That way quizzers can differentiate which quotation you're talking about, just similar to finish the verse or finish this. And then you must start the question with at the beginning of a quotation or at the beginning of a sentence within a quotation. Again, as long as you're, yes, the beginning of a situation question must occur within the first 2 verses of a quotation. So you can't start a quotation for a situation question 3 verses into a quotation. You have to start it within 2 verses, and you have to also and it must not exceed 2 verses in length. So technically speaking, if you had a situation or a quotation rather that was 2 verses long and you started it the second verse into the quotation, you would cover that third verse of the quotation. That's the only time you'll ever cover the third verse, is if it occurs in a two verse quotation starting on the second verse of the quotation. But yeah, so the beginning of a situation question must occur within the first 2 verses. And this is an interesting one that not many people know about, but a quotation that is broken up by non-quotation words can be read without those words if the quote is not interrupted. This is the only case where you can read a question as a quizmaster and not actually be reading the verbatim material, because you can exclude parts of the material to make the situation flow better. So a good example, this is Acts chapter 10, verse 26. The verse reads, "But Peter made him get up. Stand up, he said, I am only a man myself." That's the verse. The way it could be asked as a quotation is, stand up, I am only a man myself. So you're eliminating that he said in the middle of the verse to make the quotation flow better. And so that is an option that you have. Yeah, and as long as the quote is not interrupted. So that's Acts chapter 10, verse 26 is a great example. There are other there could be other places where a quote is interrupted, and And so therefore it's not good to just skip over that interruption because it would be very difficult to follow as a quizzer. Okay, and then some examples of situation questions. Let's go here. So, who and to whom? Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my father promised, which you have heard me speak about. This is from Acts chapter 1, verse 4, and the answer is Jesus to the apostles. This is I would call this a good situation. It's got a quotation, and the answers are both within context. And then another example, who said it? For it is written in the book of Psalms, may his place be deserted, let there be no one to dwell in it, and may another take his place of leadership. Peter said it, and it's from Acts chapter 1, verse 20. Again, good situation. The quotation doesn't exceed 2 verses, and the answer is within context. And again, context for a situation question is the 5 verses. And that's something that can be overlooked sometimes. You might think that, oh, it needs to be Peter said blah, 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 right? You have to have the Peter said right before the quotation in order for it to be valid. But actually, if you have he said and then the quotation, and then Peter is clarified maybe 1 verse or 2 verses before that, that still works as a situation. You can still make that still valid because Peter is an answer to who said it, and it's within context. It's within 5 verses. Another example, who said it and how was it said? So he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After the death of his father, God sent him to the land where you are now living. This is from Acts chapter 7, verse 4. And this is Stephen replied. And you're probably guessing where this is going. This is invalid. This starts after this. This starts way after. This starts, yeah, after the second verse in the quotation. And so for that reason, it is not valid. And the reason for that being, well, yeah, when you have long quotations like Stephen's, if you're asking who said it, the answer is likely going to be out of context. It's going to be 10 verses out of context anyway. So there's a rule that you have to start the situation 2 verses in, and that helps. So another example: who said it? How was it said? And to whom was it said? Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. So the voice spoke to him, Peter, a second time. Definitely a more challenging situation from Acts chapter 10, verse 15. However, this one is actually also invalid. The first 5 words are not unique to all quotations. I believe in chapter 11, another quotation starts with the first 5 words, do not call anything impure. So for that reason, unfortunately, that situation would be invalid. Okay, and that's all I have for situation questions. I'm just going to check the chat again. Okay. Oh yeah, okay, so Ning, I see a comment. And okay, so there's some good questions. So I'll scroll over here and check. I'll stop sharing briefly. So let's see. So Andrea says, just a comment, our quizzers often mention how it is hard to answer finish 2 verse, finish the next, this and the next, quote 2 verses, as one verse is a 150 or 300 verse, and the second verse is not. Right. The comment from the quizzers is that they seem like trick questions. Not sure that there's a solution to this, but it would be nice if it was a 150 question. Both verses would be 150 material. I get that, and I actually experienced that too because I quizmaster the rookie quizzers at Avalon, and oftentimes a question like that will come up, and they don't like it because it does seem like a trick question. Now, unfortunately, there really isn't, because all the key verses and the 300 verses are set.
I've added my comments, and the chat
okay.
is a response to that.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks. Okay. So maybe I might, if I need to, I might cover that at the end. I'll just maybe for now I'll go to Ning Ning's question. She said, I might have missed this, but context between the quote and the answers to the situation is how many verses? That would be 5 verses. Or so, yeah, 5 verses before and after the quotation. So if the quotation starts in Acts chapter 1, verse 10, you have all the way back to Acts chapter 1, verse 4 to have your answers. And maybe that quotation does go 2 verses long and it goes into verse 11. You have until verse 17 as well for context. So yeah, you have those 5 verses before and after the entire quotation, even if it's 2 verses. So it could be up to 12 verses for context. Okay, so I will continue to, hold on. Share here. Okay. Reference questions. Reference questions are difficult. So I kind of split this into a few sections. So reference understanding. And I'll try to explain this in a way that to me seemed the most intuitive, because reference questions are definitely the toughest question type to, maybe not necessarily to write, but definitely to understand. So reference questions are, yeah, perhaps the hardest question type to grasp. Think of a good way to think of a reference question is a straightforward question that is not unique. So it would be, you could take some of the invalid straightforward questions that I was showing earlier, and you could turn them into reference questions. So for example, the question, I will what, is not unique because the phrase I will appears more than once in the material. However, we can use the non-unique phrase I will to form reference questions. And so go through that. So to make a reference question, you take any non-unique phrase and you add the required reference. So, and what reference you add depends on the where the phrase shows up. So you only need, so you add a chapter reference if the phrase appears only once in the chapter. So I believe in chapter 9, the phrase I will appears only once. So since it appears only once in that chapter, you would only need to add a chapter reference to I will to make a chapter reference question. According to Acts chapter 9, I will what? Would be a valid chapter reference question. However, like in chapter 2, I will, the phrase I will appears multiple times, and so you must add both a chapter and verse reference if the phrase appears more than once in the chapter. So yeah, in that case, in chapter 2, you'd have to specify both the chapter and the verse where the question is from, along with the phrase, in order for that to be a valid reference question. So, yes, like I said, the phrase I will appears multiple times in chapter 2, but only once in chapter 9. And keep in mind, the phrase I will is non-unique. If it was a unique phrase, you wouldn't be able to do any of this stuff in the first place because there's only one option for the question. It would be a straightforward question. But the phrase I will is non-unique, and so you can use it to write reference questions. So, like I said, it appears multiple times in chapter 2, but only once in chapter 9. So in chapter 2, I'm just showing here the phrase I will appears in verse 17, 18, 19, and 25, and it appears only in verse 16 in chapter 9. So if you think of all those verses as different possibilities for questions, right? In order for the quizzer to know exactly which verse you're talking about, right? If you're in chapter 2, verse 17, they're going to need to know the chapter and the verse in order to narrow it down to the verse. Because if you only give them the chapter, there's still 4 possibilities left. There's still verse 17, 18, 19, and 25. So you have to give them the chapter and the verse in order for them to know exactly what verse you're talking about and to be able to answer the question, I will what? Now, in the case of chapter 9, if you give the quizzer according to Acts chapter 9, I will what? There is only one verse in that chapter where the phrase I will appears. It's verse 16. So you only need to give them the chapter in order for them to know exactly, or at least be able to know exactly what verse you're referring to. Okay, man, I should have done that earlier. Anyways, so yes, using the phrase I will in Acts chapter 2, verse 17, according to Acts chapter 2, verse 17, I will what? I will pour out my spirit on all people. And in Acts chapter 9, verse 16, you say, according to Acts chapter 9, I will what? So again, just giving in chapter 2, you have to give both the chapter and the verse in order for them to know exactly what verse you're talking about. And in Acts chapter 9, verse 16, you only have to give them the chapter, because the phrase I will appears only once in that chapter. This is, yeah, it's complicated, but hopefully that explanation kind of clears things up. And the answer to that question is, I will show him how much he must suffer for my name, which, yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to go and talk about different types of reference questions. So there's the chapter verse reference. So a chapter verse reference must have a single answer. And by the way, yeah, these are now we're on to the requirements. So that was just understanding how reference questions work. These are the requirements. So chapter verse reference questions, that's where you're giving a chapter and a verse reference along with the phrase, like according to Acts chapter 2, verse 17, I will what? They must have a single answer. The question must contain a word or phrase that exists more than once in the chapter. Context is that single verse, the single reference where you're asking the question. And the question should be in the form, according to blank, chapter blank, verse blank, and then you have the interrogative, right? The what, who, why, where, when, how, paired with the non-unique phrase. So I will is the non-unique phrase and what is the interrogative. So that's the formula for building a chapter verse reference right there. Chapter references, very similar. They must have a single answer. They must contain a word or phrase that exists more than once in the material, but only once in the chapter, like I was talking about earlier. And the question text should be in the form according to blank chapter blank, and then you include the question. So according to Acts chapter 9, verse 6, I will what? Or 9 verse 16, I will what? Is an example of a chapter reference. And then now there's two other, I guess, subtypes, if you will, or types, actually. They're different types. There's multiple answer chapter verse references, and they're very similar to chapter verse references. They must meet all the requirements of a CVR, replacing the single answer requirement with the multiple answer requirement. Similarly, for a multiple answer chapter reference, they must meet all the requirements of a chapter reference, but instead of a single answer, they must have a multiple answer. So you'd write a multiple answer chapter verse reference if you were using the phrase I will what, but the answer had multiple answers. Okay, so other requirements, similar to straightforward questions, you got to ensure that the question and answer follow clearly, avoid vague, misleading phrasing, and ensure that the question has either a single answer or multiple answers, depending on what type you're writing. Exactly, just like I mentioned before with straightforward and with multiple answer questions. And then you also have to ensure that the question itself is answered, similar to what I was talking about before, with you can't have negative answers. Those aren't valid. And then some suggestions I have for writing reference questions. And this is just me, I don't have as much experience writing reference questions as I do with straightforward questions, but these are just some suggestions I have. So whenever I'm writing reference questions or editing them, I attempt to find long, non-unique phrases that could be used for reference questions. And what that basically means is if I find a long phrase that is not unique, I immediately try and write a reference question for that phrase because it's a good reference question. Because usually for reference questions, the longer the better. You don't want to make reference questions that are, and I think I'm going to come to this slide here in a second, but you don't want to make reference questions that are like you what or he what, very, very short reference questions that are technically valid, but are just extremely short and just very tricky for quizzers to answer. So it's good to attempt to find long phrases that you can use for reference questions. And this particularly rewards quizzers who know their references well and or have studied a list. And so that's why I write questions like these. That's not to say that I avoid writing shorter questions, but I definitely try and find all the possible longer reference questions that I could write. And then, like I said, avoid short, non-unique word or phrases that are vague, such as I, what, or we, what, has what, this, what, etc. There's quite a few examples of this. They're just much too tricky and really unreasonable to write or to ask of quizzers. A good general rule is to check if that phrase appears 10 times in a single chapter. And if it appears more than 10 times, there's a very good chance that it's a very short, vague phrase. That's one way you can check. Typically, you can just check by looking at the word or phrase, and you'll immediately recognize that it would be quite vague to ask. But a good general rule is to check if it appears more than 10 times or about 10 times. Reference questions, like I said, with these words are not necessarily invalid, but they can be unnecessarily tricky. And then I'll give a few examples of reference questions. So, according to Acts chapter 2, verse 17, what days? The last days. I would classify this as a good CVR. It does have a one-word phrase, days, but arguably days is much, much less vague than the word I. So I would call that a good chapter verse reference. And then according to Acts chapter 20, verse 25, I have what? Gone about preaching the kingdom. Now this one, I was kind of on the fence about this one when I was writing it. In my opinion, I said it was worse because on its own, it seems fine. However, in the context of the verse, it becomes a tricky question. So the verse reads, "Now I know that none of you among whom I have gone about preaching the kingdom will ever see me again." So in that context, the phrase "I have" appears right in the middle of a statement, not at the beginning. And so in the context of the verse, it becomes a much trickier question. And so I would generally avoid writing a question like this. That's not to say that you can't. It's just personal preference for me. I would avoid writing this question. According to Acts chapter 20, verse 21, I have what? Declared to both Jews and Gentiles that they must turn to God in repentance and have faith in our Lord Jesus. Again, a good, solid CVR question. According to Acts chapter 6, verse 1, what days? Those days. This one is invalid, as, first of all, just reading the question without any knowledge of the material, the answer is those. So it's not as strong of a CVR, but it's invalid once you realize that the phrase days, or the word days, only appears once in the chapter. So you could actually write a chapter reference according to Acts chapter 6, what days, but you could not write a chapter verse reference because the word days appears only once in the chapter, not multiple times. And that's one of the requirements for a CVR, is it has to appear multiple times. Moving on, according to Acts chapter 20, verse 21, I have what? Not hesitated to proclaim to you the whole will of God. This one is invalid. It's negative. You could attempt to fix this question by writing I have not what. You'd have to check that I have not what, or the phrase I have not appears multiple times in chapter 20. And then if it did, that would be a valid CVR. But you could not write it in this form because the answer is negative and it's misleading. According to Acts chapter 11, verse 21, a great number of people what? Believed and turned to the Lord. This is invalid if written as a CVR, but it's good if you write it as an MA CVR because obviously it has multiple answers. Believed and turned to the Lord. Now we're getting into some chapter references. According to Acts chapter 1, do not what? Leave Jerusalem. I would classify this as a good question. It's got a straightforward answer, and the phrase do not is much more specific or is much less vague. And then according to Acts chapter 19, they have what? Neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. Again, another example of a negative, actually, in this case, two negative answers. So this would not be a valid CV or chapter reference if you wrote it this way. If you wrote it as a multiple answer chapter reference, and you also included they have neither what, if that was a valid question, then it would work. But it's a negative, so it's invalid. According to Acts chapter 5, fighting how? Fighting against God? Now, this is a valid question. Well, actually, no, sorry, it's not a valid question because it's misleading and also doesn't answer the question. If you ask, if you're saying fighting against God, it just kind of leaves it open in the air. Of course, we know we're not, spiritually speaking, meant to fight against God. And so the question is pretty misleading and doesn't really answer the question. So for that reason, it would be invalid. And sometimes it's kind of subjective whether it's misleading or not, which is tricky. But in this case, I think it's a good example of a very misleading question. Next example, according to Acts chapter 4, to stop what? This thing. From Acts chapter 4, verse 17. This is, it's a word, like you could write it, but it is a very, very vague question, both question and answer. So I would avoid writing that question myself. A few more examples here, 2 more actually. According to Acts chapter 1, what gift? The gift my father promised, from Acts chapter 1, verse 4. This is a great chapter reference. According to Acts chapter 1, Mary, the mother of whom? Jesus. Acts chapter 1, verse 14. It's good. The answer follows directly from the question. And the question is not vague. So those are all the examples I have for reference questions. In terms of tools, writing reference questions just by hand with just purely the book can be arduous because you have to check you have to check the concordance, which might not necessarily have the words or phrases, all the words or phrases that you need. It'll have all the references, but it won't have the specific places where the phrase shows up. So it could be a lot of looking and flipping through your book if you're only writing reference questions with your book. So this Christian Bible quizzing app that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar is a extremely useful tool for writing reference questions. And again, I'm not going to really go into detail and cover CBQZ, but I'd just like to highlight its usefulness here in writing reference questions. It has a searchable concordance. This is just a screenshot from the website. As I was mentioning earlier, the phrase "I will," if you put that into the searchable concordance, here it'll give you all the and I'm not even showing the whole screen, but just 3 of the possible answers it gives you. It gives you all the possible all the possible times where that exact phrase "I will" shows up. So very easy to see whether you need to whether you could write a chapter reference or a CBR based on if that phrase appears more than once in the chapter. And then additionally, it's got other things. So it has unique words in blue. Words that appear only once in a chapter appear red, and words that are part of a 2-word phrase appear green. So particularly the blue and green words can be useful for writing straightforward questions, but the red words are very, very useful for writing chapter references because they only appear once in a chapter. So you can pretty much almost take any red word in the application and write a CBR right off the bat without having to look up anything. So here's an example of just the material in the software. That blue word there is a unique word. The word wrote appears only once in chapter 1. So a valid question could be maybe wrote what? I would probably attempt to make it longer, but wrote what would be a valid chapter reference question because wrote appears only once in that chapter. And then the word Jesus is part of a 2-word phrase. With the word began, Jesus began would be a 2-word phrase. So very useful notation and searchable concordance, and makes writing reference questions easy, if not slightly easier than writing straightforward questions, in fact. Okay, so that ends my talk on reference questions. I'll just check if there's any questions in. Okay, there's a question in the chat. When you talk about studying a list, are there lists available for quizzers to study, or is this something quizzers would go through and create for themselves? Great question. So there There are, yes and no. So there are lists available for Quizizz to study, which would be the practice set that would be distributed to churches, right? And so Quizizz could take questions directly from that set, say take all this chapter verse references from that set and make them into a list and study that list. Or they could take all the multiple answers and so forth for all the different question types. And there's also the option of, because those practice sets are not 100% of all the questions, right? I'm not sure what they are. They're much less than that. So you can definitely study the practice set, but it's not going to be, it's going to be definitely good. It's good to study the practice set. Of course, I would argue that the most powerful thing for a Quizizz to study would be just to improve their material and to memorize more verses and review. But then if they want to go beyond that, of course, studying the practice set could be good. And then even beyond that, making your own list, right? Going through the material and creating lists, as I'm going to be talking about right now. So writing question lists is typically only useful for the following question types. Multiple answer, finish this in the next, situation, CR, multiple answer, chapter reference, and it's sometimes CVR and multiple answer, chapter verse references. And for CVRs, I put, depending on how long the chapters are, a CVR list is typically not very useful just because of the sheer amount of CVRs that there could be. Again, depends on the chapter, but CVR lists, I would say, are not as useful as, say, a CR list. And when I'm talking about question list writing, I'm talking about from the perspective of a quizzer, or if you're a coach working with a quizzer for them to write a list to study. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about question list writing. I'm not talking about writing questions for the district list or the district set. I'm talking about, writing questions with your quizzer or having your quizzer write questions for a list to study. Should have clarified that, but that's said. So a multiple answer list, just some tips that I have when you're writing a multiple answer. Again, refer to the requirements, refer to the rule book for the requirements of multiple answers. Some tips that I have for writing these lists, I'll just go through them. So for a multiple answer list, look for keywords such as and or. They almost always constitute a multiple answer, depending on where they occur in the verse. And also commas, I should mention. Commas can give you an indication that if you see multiple commas in a row, there's probably a list. And then write questions as short as possible for a multiple answer list. And this is from the perspective of a quizzer or a coach and a quizzer or whatever combination writing a list. It's better to write the questions as short as possible, because if you write longer questions, right, then the actual question could end up being shorter that's asked in the quiz, right? And that could throw the quizzer off guard in their list, right? Because they could be studying the first words of the question. So it's more helpful to write questions that are as short as possible in order to catch that. Because it turns out if you write a question that's shorter than the actual question during the quiz, well, that longer question contains the shorter question, just because it has to in order to be a multiple answer. So writing a short question will ensure that you get all the possible multiple answer questions that could be asked, or at least part of all the multiple answer questions that could be asked, and is more useful for studying. And then for a finish this and the next list, look for all quotations or periods in the middle of verses. And there's quite a few of them in Acts, actually. So those are good. Of course, those are the requirements for finish this and the next. So that should be obvious. But and then a situation list, scan quotation context to determine possible interrogatives. And what I was talking about earlier was they don't have to be necessarily right behind the quotation. They can be up to 5 verses before or after. Break up the list by these possible interrogatives if you're a quizzer. So break them up into the list of all the possible situations with only who said it, or only about whom was it said, or only to whom was it said, or all the ones that have 3 parts to them. And if you break up the list, it actually becomes many lists that you can then study almost independently. So that's my tips for writing a situation list. A chapter reference list, look for longer phrases that are repeated throughout the material. Those are very, very likely to be written as chapter references. And then also make note of verses that are highly dense in chapter reference questions. So as you're writing your chapter reference list, you can see, okay, there's maybe 4 or 5 verses where there are 10 or maybe 15 chapter references. That way I know maybe if I jump too fast accidentally on this chapter, if I just start quoting in this area, I'm probably going to be in context of a chapter reference question and have a much better chance of answering. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're writing a CR list. And then CBR list takes a lot of effort to write a complete list, depending on the year, of course, but however, they can be useful for shorter chapters. So for Galatians, Ephesians, or I believe Corinthians, it was much more useful to write a CBR list. Acts, not as much, and definitely books like Luke, where the chapters can be 70 verses long. It's much better to just learn to quote backwards, actually, is a better option. And quoting backwards, I won't get into too much detail, but basically, if you quote backwards, you're more likely to get the answer first, then run into the question first. And so if you run into the answer first, then if you quote the question after the answer, this is kind of confusing, but if you quote the question after the answer, then the quizmaster will ask, what's your question? And so then you're able to, basically, the reason why you quote backwards is to single out the question. Because if you just quote through the verse, then there's not really a way to do that. And that's only if you jump on the reference. If you jump on the question, you really don't have to worry about this. And this you really only have to worry about in the most competitive of scenarios, and most of the time, it's better to get your material down, review it, practice it a lot more, and then if you do have it down really well, then start writing a list. MACBR and MACR lists are by far the easiest lists to make. They have the least number of questions, and you can sometimes write MA references from an MA list, right? If you have a longer multiple answer question that, when shortened, could turn into a reference question because the phrase appears more than once now that it's shorter, then you can include that in your list. And then I have here theoretical situations. What if Quizzer wants to make a quote list? They're almost never helpful at district meets, and it's better off to just improve reference recall. Knowing what verses are 150 and 300 is definitely useful because those are definitely more often quoted. And making a quote list is not super productive again. And if you know your material really well, you're going to have the intrinsic knowledge of, okay, this verse does not make as much sense as a quote. This verse is better. But that's nothing saying you can't make a quote list. It's just much better to do these other things. Last of all, what if Quizzer wants to make a straightforward list? That is intense. Practicing unique words and phrases from the back of the book is a much more efficient way of improving at straightforwards than doing a list. So again, this is after they've mastered all their material and they want to make a list. It's better if they practice the unique words and phrases from the back of the book. And if they want to make a list, it's a good practice, but it's not practical to try and memorize an interrogative list. It's better to just practice unique words and phrases. And with that is the end of the whole webinar. So any questions? I'll check the chat first to see if there are any questions that came up, and then if people want to ask questions with their microphone, they can. So I would discourage list unless quizzers memorizing total material. Exactly, yeah. Unless they have total material, it really does not make sense for them to start writing a list, because lists are they're not as, put it simply, they're not as efficient as memorizing more verses, right? Memorizing more verses is the best way to improve at quizzing. So making a list is more work and it's less reward. And so, yeah, memorizing total material is a much better alternative to improving than starting a list. Are there any other questions or comments? For FTVs, it's useful to make a list of verses that are unique after 1 word, 2 words. Yes, that is very true. Yeah. Right, I could have mentioned that, I guess, but yes, FTVs. There's quite a few FTVs that are, it depends on the year again. Let's start with therefore, that aren't key after 1 or 2 words. But if you have a list of those FTVs that are, unique after 1 or 2 words, then you can really improve, you can really speed up your jumping speed confidently on Finish the Verses. So that's a very good point. Any other questions? Or comments, like if you have a quizzer that's, wanting to make a list, wanting to improve, or is struggling to understand a question or anything. Reflecting on that comment back that was talking about quotes and Finish the Verses, or quote twos and finish twos going into full material. That's actually a really good reason to encourage your quizzers to take a look at the material, take a look at the verses that are that turn into quote twos or finish twos, and for them to just memorize those extra verses. In some chapters, it'll only be 1 or 2 verses, or in most chapters, I would argue, for 150 and 300. It would depend on the chapter, but yeah, having them go through and memorize those just extra few verses every week. It's not that much per week, again, depending on the chapter, but it will add up and it will help them to avoid getting stuck on those. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, absolutely. You can share the slides with your quizzers, anyone who this would benefit. And I'm guessing we'll probably post this in some form, either on an email or on the website or somewhere. We'll see. So. You're welcome. Okay, I guess that concludes it. Just this. Okay, well, hope everyone has a great evening and found this helpful, and have a great night. Bye.